In 2031, the Deep Space Listening Array at the Arecibo Observatory successor station in Chile picked up something unusual. Not unusual in the way that pulsars were unusual when they were first discovered, their regular beats mistaken briefly for alien communication. No, this was unusual in a way that made the graduate student on monitoring duty that night stare at her screen for 17 minutes without moving, her coffee growing cold in her hand, her breath forming small clouds in the chilled air of the control room. The signal came from the direction of Kepler 442b, an exoplanet roughly 1,200 light-years away in the constellation Lyra. Kepler 442b had been identified years earlier as one of the most promising candidates for harboring life, sitting comfortably in its star's habitable zone, potentially rocky, potentially holding liquid water on its surface. Dozens of papers had been written about it. Children had drawn pictures of what life there might look like. It had captured the public imagination in the way that certain celestial objects sometimes do, becoming not just a catalog number but a possibility, a maybe, a what if. The signal was not random noise. It had structure, repetition, mathematical relationships embedded in its timing. It pulsed in patterns that suggested, no, that screamed intentionality. Dr. Sarah Chin, the graduate student who first noticed it, initiated the full recording protocol and sent an encrypted message to her department head. Within 6 hours, the observatory was locked down. Within 24 hours, representatives from 6 governments and 12 scientific institutions were on site. Within a week, the signal had been confirmed by 7 other listening posts around the globe. We were not alone. The message was long, extremely long. It took months just to determine where the signal began and ended, to understand its basic structure. It seemed to be composed of discrete packets of information, each packet separated by a brief pause, like paragraphs in a letter or chapters in a book. Teams worked around the clock, the world's best cryptographers, mathematicians, linguists, and computer scientists all focused on the same goal: understanding what Kepler 442b was trying to tell us. It took 3 years to crack the basic mathematical framework. The beings who sent the message had used prime numbers as a key, a Rosetta Stone to help us understand their counting system, their basic logical structures. From there, progress accelerated. Within 5 years of the signal's discovery, we had translated roughly 30% of its content. Enough to understand the general purpose of the message. It was a warning. The civilizations of Kepler 442b, it seemed, were dead. Not recently dead. Long dead. The signal itself had been traveling for 1,200 years, sent from a world that had been dying even as they launched their last desperate message into the void. They wanted someone, anyone, to know what had happened to them. They wanted their story to survive even if they could not. But as the translation teams dug deeper into the message, as more of its content revealed itself through countless hours of painstaking work, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The beings of Kepler 442b had not died from natural causes. Their sun had not gone supernova. They had not been struck by an asteroid or ravaged by plague. They had been visited. The message described them, these visitors. The description was difficult to follow, possibly because the beings of Kepler 442b perceived reality differently than we do, possibly because the visitors were simply beyond easy description. But certain details emerged. They came from somewhere else, somewhere the message called the cold dark between, which analysts believed referred to intergalactic space, the vast voids between galaxies where even stars are rare. These visitors were not interested in communication. They did not seek to establish diplomatic relationships or trade resources or share knowledge. They came for something else, something the message struggled to articulate. The closest translation the linguistic team could produce was harvest, though several team members argued that consume was more accurate, while others insisted the proper word was something that didn't exist in any human language, something that combined elements of harvesting, learning, absorbing, and erasing. The beings of Kepler 442b had tried to resist. They had fought with weapons that ranged from crude kinetic projectiles to sophisticated quantum field disruptors. Nothing worked. The visitors could not be killed because they did not exist in a way that made death meaningful. They were not immortal, the message insisted. They were something else. Something that existed between states, between being and non-being. It took the visitors approximately 40 of Kepler 442b's years to complete their work. 40 years of watching their civilization dismantled piece by piece, not through violence or destruction but through something worse. The visitors learned them. Every language, every art form, every scientific principle, every religious belief, every personal memory from every individual on their world. The visitors absorbed it all like sponges soaking up water, and as they did, the originals faded. People began forgetting their own names. Artists lost the ability to create, not because of injury or illness, but because the fundamental spark that drove their creativity had been copied away, leaving only an empty hollow where inspiration once lived. Scientists found themselves unable to recall theories they had spent lifetimes developing. Parents looked at their children and felt nothing, all emotional connections severed or stolen or somehow transferred to these incomprehensible collectors. By the end, according to the message, there was nothing left on Kepler 442b except biological machines still going through the motions of life without understanding why. The visitors left as silently as they had arrived, carrying with them everything that had made that world's civilization meaningful, leaving behind only empty husks breathing empty air under empty skies. The message concluded with a section that the translation teams initially thought might be corrupted data. It was a list. A very long list. A list of coordinates. At first, the analysts assumed these were locations within the Kepler 442b system, perhaps other planets or moons where survivors had fled. But as the coordinate systems were decoded, a horrifying realization emerged. These were not local coordinates. They were galactic coordinates. Thousands upon thousands of them. Star systems spread across the Milky Way galaxy. Some of the coordinates corresponded to known star systems. Systems where deep space telescopes had noticed unusual atmospheric readings on habitable zone planets. Systems where promising biosignatures had been detected, then mysteriously vanished in subsequent observations. Systems that had once seemed like perfect candidates for life but now registered as strangely quiet, strangely still. 3 weeks after the coordinate list was fully translated, a junior astronomer named Rebecca Kimura noticed something that caused her to drop her tablet, the screen shattering on the laboratory floor. She had plotted the coordinates on a three-dimensional galactic map, connecting them in chronological order based on timestamps embedded in the message. The visitors were moving in a pattern. A slow spiral pattern, moving gradually inward toward the denser regions of the galaxy. Each point on the map represented a world that had been visited, learned, harvested. And the pattern was advancing. Slowly over millions of years but advancing nonetheless. Kimura ran the calculation 17 times, checking and rechecking her math, before she took her findings to her supervisor. The most recent coordinates on the list, the ones representing the visitor's most recent known location, pointed to a star system approximately 800 light-years from Earth. The message from Kepler 442b had taken 1,200 years to reach us. If the visitors maintained their observed pattern and pace, if they continued their methodical spiral inward, they would reach our region of space in approximately 400 years. 400 years. Not long at all, not in cosmic terms. But perhaps long enough that the people who read the message could rationalize not worrying about it. 400 years was someone else's problem, some future generation's crisis. We had more immediate concerns. Climate change, political conflicts, economic inequality. Why worry about a threat 4 centuries away? But here's what kept Dr. Chin awake at night, what made her stand on her apartment balcony at 3 in the morning staring up at the stars until her neck ached. The visitors moved slowly, yes, but the message was 1,200 years old. 12 centuries of travel time from Kepler 442b to Earth. The visitors could have changed course. They could have accelerated. They could have already reached our spiral arm of the galaxy. They could already be here. And we wouldn't know until it was too late, until the day someone looked at their child and couldn't remember why they had once loved them, until artists found their hands moving without purpose, until scientists woke to discover that everything they knew had become hollow information without meaning, facts without context, data without understanding. The message from Kepler 442b ended with a single phrase that the translation team struggled with for months. The literal translation was something like, "They come for the part that makes light inside," but the meaning was debated endlessly. Some thought it referred to consciousness. Others argued it meant creativity or emotion. A few insisted it was about the soul, though that word made the more secular scientists uncomfortable. Dr. Chin had her own interpretation, one she never shared in official reports but wrote in her private journal late one night. They come for the thing that makes us real. And when they leave, we're still here. Still breathing, still moving. But not real anymore. Just shadows. Just echoes. Just meat pretending it remembers what it was like to be alive. The observatory where the signal was first received still monitors Kepler 442b. Still listens to the endless stream of electromagnetic radiation pouring from that distant point in space. Sometimes, in the small hours of the morning when the day shift has left and the night shift is alone with their thoughts and their screens, they wonder if they'll hear it again. Another message. Perhaps one that says the visitors have changed course. Perhaps one that says they've moved on to some other galaxy, some other cluster of worlds waiting to be learned and hollowed out. But there's never another message. Just silence. Just the endless, patient silence of the cosmos. Just the quiet sound of something vast moving through the dark, learning everything it touches, leaving nothing behind but the shape of what used to be there. And sometimes, just sometimes, the researchers on duty swear they can feel it. A presence. Not hostile, not malicious. Just curious. Endlessly, terribly curious. Watching. Learning. Getting closer. One breath at a time. So this concludes our first chapter of this video. Let me know what do you think of this chapter, and if the story is interesting or not. We will continue shortly to the second chapter after a short break so you can digest the story and let it settle into your mind as you fall asleep. Like the video and subscribe for a good luck charm, and turn on the notifications so you know when I release a new video. For now, let's continue with the next chapter. James Whitmore had been farming his family's land in rural Kansas for 43 years when the Harvest Moon incident occurred. His grandfather had worked these same fields. His great-grandfather before that. The Whitmores knew this land, knew its moods and seasons, knew where the water pooled after spring rains and which corners of which fields produced the best yield despite soil tests suggesting otherwise. It was October, and the corn had already been harvested. The fields lay bare and brown, stubble poking up from the dark earth like the bristles of some massive brush. James had sent his seasonal workers home for the year, paid them fairly, shaken their hands, told them he'd see them next spring if the Lord was willing and the creek didn't rise. He was alone now except for his wife Margaret and their grandson Tommy, who was visiting for the week because his parents were in Denver for some conference or another. The first strange thing happened on October 12th, during what folks in Kansas call a harvest moon, though technically every full moon in October carries that name. James had stepped out onto his porch around midnight to have his nightly cigarette, a habit he'd promised Margaret he'd quit but never quite managed. The sky was clear, stars spread across the black like sugar spilled on dark cloth, and the moon hung fat and orange just above the eastern horizon. That's when he noticed the lights over the north field. Not unusual lights, not at first glance. Kansas has airplanes same as anywhere. Small craft flying overhead, crop dusters during the season, the occasional private plane puttering from one small airstrip to another. But these lights were moving wrong. Too smooth, too silent. They drifted in a pattern that made no sense for an aircraft, moving in slow arcs and perfect geometric shapes, hovering, dropping, rising again. James watched them for about 10 minutes, his cigarette burning down to the filter between his fingers, forgotten. The lights were too far away to make out details, just points of illumination moving against the dark field and darker sky. He thought about waking Margaret, but she'd accuse him of drinking, though he hadn't touched whiskey in 11 years. He thought about getting his rifle, but what would he shoot at? Lights? He wasn't some crazy person who fired weapons at things he didn't understand. So he watched. And eventually the lights stopped moving. They hovered for perhaps 30 seconds in a formation that looked almost like letters, almost like symbols, though James couldn't quite make them out at this distance. Then all at once they vanished. Not flew away. Not faded. Just gone like someone had flipped a switch. James finished his smoke, went back inside, and didn't mention it to Margaret. He wasn't sure why. It just seemed like the kind of thing that was better kept quiet, at least until he understood it better. The next morning he drove out to the north field in his truck to check the irrigation system before winter set in. The field looked normal at first. Bare earth, corn stubble, a few scattered patches where the harvest had been less complete. But as he drove the perimeter, he noticed a section where the stubble looked different. Flattened, but not in a way consistent with wind or rain. It was too precise, too geometric. A circle, maybe 60 feet in diameter, where every single piece of remaining corn stalk had been pressed down flat against the earth. James parked his truck and walked into the circle. The ground felt normal under his boots. The stubble crunched in the usual way. But there was a smell, faint but distinct. Like ozone, like the air smells after a lightning strike, metallic and sharp. He knelt down and touched the flattened stalks. They weren't broken. They had been bent, pressed down with tremendous force but not damaged. The stalks formed a perfect spiral pattern emanating from the center of the circle, like water going down a drain. At the exact center, he found something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something older, something that lived in the part of his brain that remembered when humans were prey animals, when things hunted us in the dark. There was a shape in the dirt. Not a footprint, not an animal track. Something else. It looked almost like a handprint, but wrong. Too many fingers or not enough, he couldn't tell. The impression was about a foot across, pressed maybe 2 inches deep into the hard October earth. Around it, in a circle perhaps 3 feet in diameter, the soil had changed color. It was darker, almost black, and when James touched it, his fingers came away with a residue that felt greasy and smelled like nothing he'd ever encountered before. He should have called someone. The sheriff maybe. Or one of his neighbors. But something stopped him. Some instinct that said calling attention to this would be a mistake. So he took a few photos with his phone, old model, pictures came out grainy and unclear. Then he got back in his truck and drove home. That night his dog disappeared. Rusty, an old Australian shepherd who'd been with the family for 12 years, never wandered far from the house. But when James went out to give him his evening food, the dog bowl sat untouched and Rusty was nowhere to be found. James called for him, walking the property with his flashlight, Margaret joining him with growing concern in her voice. Tommy came too, young and excited by the unexpected night adventure. They found Rusty 3 hours later, or what was left of him. The dog was in the south field, about a quarter mile from the house, lying in the middle of what James immediately recognized as another circle. This one was smaller, maybe 20 feet across, and the dog lay at its exact center. Rusty was alive, technically. His sides rose and fell with breath. His eyes were open. But when James approached, his beloved dog didn't react. Didn't raise his head, didn't wag his tail, didn't whine or bark or show any sign of recognition. James knelt beside him and touched his fur. Rusty's eyes tracked the movement, but there was nothing in them. No personality, no recognition, no spark of the friend James had known for over a decade. Margaret started crying. Tommy asked what was wrong with Rusty in a small, scared voice. James had no answer. He scooped the dog up in his arms, Rusty making no protest, no reaction at all, and carried him back to the house. They laid him in his bed by the fireplace. He stayed there, breathing, eyes open, for 3 more days before he finally stopped breathing at all. The veterinarian they called couldn't find anything wrong. No injuries, no signs of disease, no obvious cause for the dog's condition. His brain activity was normal. His body was functioning. But something essential was gone. The vet suggested, delicately, that perhaps the old dog had had a stroke, some kind of cognitive event that left him in this vegetative state. James didn't argue, just thanked the vet and paid the bill and buried Rusty out behind the barn with his own hands. More livestock began disappearing after that. Old Johnson's prize heifer vanished from a locked barn, the doors still bolted from the outside the next morning. The McKennas lost half their chickens over a single night, no blood, no feathers, just gone. Susan Hartfield's horses were found standing in their pasture at dawn, unharmed but different. They responded to commands but without enthusiasm, without the personality each horse had possessed the day before. They were alive but empty, like someone had scooped out their souls and left the bodies behind to go through the motions. People started talking, the way people do in small communities where everyone knows everyone and secrets are impossible to keep. The talk was quiet at first, mentioned in whispers at the feed store, in quick conversations after church. But it grew. Someone mentioned lights in the sky. Someone else had found strange marks in their field. A third person's cat had gone missing and returned 3 days later, physically fine but behaviorally wrong, sitting motionless in corners and staring at nothing for hours. James knew he should say something, share what he'd seen, what he'd found. But that same instinct kept him quiet. Drawing attention felt dangerous in a way he couldn't articulate. Like moving in the presence of a predator. Like making noise in the dark when you're not sure what's out there listening. On the night of October 23rd, 11 days after he'd first seen the lights, James woke to find Tommy standing in the doorway of his bedroom. The boy's face was illuminated by moonlight streaming through the window, and he was smiling. Not a child's smile. Something else. Something that used Tommy's face but didn't understand what a real smile was supposed to look like. "They want to meet you, Grandpa," Tommy said, his voice flat, emotionless. "They're curious about you. They think you're interesting." James sat up slowly, careful not to wake Margaret beside him. "Who wants to meet me, Tommy?" "The ones who came to learn," Tommy said. "They've been here before a long time ago. That's where the old stories come from. The things people saw in the sky. The things that took people away. They come back sometimes when they're curious. When they want to remember how we feel." "How we feel," James repeated, his mouth dry. Tommy nodded, that wrong smile still fixed on his face. "They learned feeling once. Long ago. But they forget. So they come back to feel again, through us. They're doing it now. They're feeling through me. Through the dog. Through the cows and chickens and cats. They want to feel through you too." James reached for the bedside lamp, but Tommy shook his head. "Don't," the boy said. The light makes it harder for them to concentrate. They like the dark. It's closer to where they live. Where do they live, Tommy? The boy tilted his head, considering the question with an alien thoughtfulness. Between. In the spaces. Where everything is cold and nothing feels anything. They like it there. It's peaceful. But sometimes they miss feeling, so they visit places like this. Places where things feel so much they can't help it. Margaret stirred beside James. Tommy's eyes flicked to her, and for just a moment, his expression changed. The real Tommy surfaced, breaking through whatever had taken hold of him. His eyes went wide with fear and his mouth opened in a silent scream before the blankness returned, that horrible smile sliding back into place. "They want you to come outside, Grandpa," Tommy said. "They want you to stand in the field and let them learn you. It doesn't hurt. Ask Rusty. Ask the others. It doesn't hurt. You just stop being you, and that's actually a relief. No more worrying. No more fearing. No more anything. Just quiet." James stood slowly from the bed. He was a large man, still strong despite his age, and he moved carefully around the boy toward the door. "I'll come outside," he said. "But first I need to get dressed. Can't go outside in my pajamas." Tommy considered this, then nodded. "Okay. But hurry. They don't like to wait. Time is different for them. Waiting makes them confused. When they're confused, they make mistakes. They take too much. Like they did with Rusty. They didn't mean to take all of him. They were just curious and they took too much, and then there was nothing left to be curious about." James dressed quickly, pulling on jeans and a flannel shirt with shaking hands. Margaret was still asleep and he was grateful for that. He leaned down and kissed her forehead gently, tasting salt even though she wasn't crying, wasn't even awake. His own tears, he realized. He was crying without knowing why. Tommy led him downstairs and out onto the porch. The October night was cold and James could see his breath misting in the air. The field stretched out before them, dark and silent. And there, over the north field again, were the lights. They were closer now. Close enough that James could see they weren't solid objects but something else, something that existed in more dimensions than his eyes could properly process. They shifted and changed, folding in on themselves, geometries that hurt to look at directly. Colors that had no names, that seemed to bypass his eyes and press directly into his brain. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" Tommy said beside him, and his voice was full of genuine wonder now, the boy's real personality surfacing briefly. "I wish I could paint them. I wish I could show Mom and Dad. But they wouldn't understand. They'd be scared." "I'm scared too, Tommy," James said quietly. "I know," the boy replied. "But you don't have to be. They're just curious. They don't mean any harm. They just want to know what it's like. To be us. To feel what we feel. And in exchange we get to feel what they feel. Which is nothing. Which is peace. Which is rest." The lights drifted closer and James could feel them now, a pressure against his mind like the feeling before a thunderstorm, like the weight of the air changing. They wanted in. They wanted to learn him, to experience his memories and feelings and thoughts, to understand what it meant to be a human named James Whitmore who had farmed Kansas land for 43 years and loved his wife and grandson and dead dog. And if they learned him, what would be left? Would he become like Rusty, alive but empty? Would he stand in his fields going through the motions of farming without understanding why? Would he look at Margaret and feel nothing, all love scooped out and replaced with hollow silence? James made a decision. He turned and grabbed Tommy, lifting the boy despite his protests, and ran. He ran back into the house, slammed the door, locked it with shaking hands. He carried Tommy upstairs and put him in bed, the boy struggling now, crying, saying, "They're disappointed, Grandpa, they're disappointed and confused, and you made them confused," over and over. He woke Margaret and told her to pack a bag. They were leaving right now, no questions. She started to protest but saw his face and stopped. Within 20 minutes they were in the truck, Tommy strapped in the back seat still crying about disappointing them, about making them confused, about how they'd have to take more now to understand, more than they meant to. James drove south through the night, away from the farm, away from the lights, away from the circles in the field. He drove until dawn broke pink and orange over the horizon, until Tommy finally stopped crying and fell into a troubled sleep, until Margaret's hand found his on the steering wheel and squeezed gently. They never went back to the farm. James sold it through a broker, never stepping foot on the property again. He heard later that the new owners had complained about livestock dying mysteriously, about strange marks in the fields, about feeling watched when they went outside at night. But they stuck it out longer than James had, and eventually the incidents stopped. Or maybe the visitors finished learning what they came to learn and moved on. Or maybe they're still there, waiting in the dark fields under the harvest moon, curious about what makes humans feel fear and love and hope, trying to understand those emotions by taking them away piece by piece until there's nothing left but empty bodies going through the motions of life. Tommy recovered mostly. He didn't remember much about that week in Kansas, just fragments of dreams about beautiful lights and feeling peaceful and cold. Sometimes he woke up crying, saying he disappointed someone but he couldn't remember who. Sometimes he stared out windows for hours watching the sky, waiting. James never looked up at night anymore. He kept his eyes on the ground, on the immediate, on the here and now. Because he knew that if he looked up, he might see lights moving in patterns that made no sense, and if he saw them again this time he might not run. This time he might stand in the field and let them learn him. Because Tommy had been right about one thing. Would be a relief. So this concludes our second chapter of this video. Let me know what do you think of this chapter, and if the story is interesting or not. We will continue shortly to the third chapter after a short break so you can digest the story and let it settle into your mind as you fall asleep. Like the video and subscribe for a good luck charm, and turn on the notifications so you know when I release a new video. For now, let's continue with the next chapter. Dr. Natasha Kozlov had been the lead xenoarchaeologist aboard the research vessel Meridian for 7 years when they discovered the ruins on Epsilon 339c. 7 years of cataloging dead civilizations on dead worlds, piecing together the remnants of species that had risen to intelligence and then fallen silent, leaving behind only fragments and questions and the eternal mystery of why. The ruins shouldn't have been there. Epsilon 339c was a rocky planet orbiting a red dwarf star in a system so remote that its catalog number had 3 digits and no proper name. The survey had been routine, one of hundreds conducted by long-range probes over the past century. The planet registered as having basic mineral deposits worth cataloging, a thin atmosphere that was technically breathable but inadvisable, and no biosignatures past or present. No one expected ruins. They were massive, stretching for miles across the planet's southern continent. From orbit they looked like geometric patterns, precise and deliberate, carved into the rust-colored stone as if the planet itself had been used as a canvas for some cosmic artist working on an incomprehensible scale. Natasha had seen ruins before. Ancient temples on Mars, predating human civilization by millions of years. The crystalline cities on Europa, frozen beneath kilometers of ice. The orbital platforms of Titan, still rotating slowly around Saturn's largest moon, their original builders vanished without explanation. But this was different. This was older. Much older. The dating equipment put the ruins at approximately 2.3 billion years old. That number made no sense. 2 billion years ago, Earth had only single-celled life. The galaxy was fundamentally different, stars that now were dead had still burned bright, the cosmic landscape unrecognizable. For a civilization to exist that long ago, to build on this scale, required a fundamental rewrite of everything humanity thought it understood about the development of intelligent life. The Meridian landed a team of 12. Natasha led them, accompanied by geologists, engineers, biologists just in case there were any remnant biosignatures, and a documentary crew because everything these days required documentation. They set up a base camp at the edge of the ruins and began their work. The first week was routine. Mapping, scanning, taking samples, trying to understand the basic layout of the structures. The ruins seemed to be one massive complex rather than a collection of separate buildings. Corridors connected chambers, chambers connected to larger halls, halls opened into spaces so vast that the portable lights they brought couldn't illuminate the far walls. Everything was carved from the planet's native stone, or rather, the stone had been somehow reshaped at the molecular level, transformed from rough rock into smooth surfaces that showed no tool marks, no sign of any construction method humanity recognized. The corridors angled down. Always down. The team descended gradually, following passages that spiraled into the planet's crust like threads on a screw. The air grew colder as they went deeper, and the pressure increased despite the thin atmosphere outside. Their instruments showed the ruins extended at least 3 kilometers below the surface, possibly further. Perhaps much further. On the 8th day they found the Chamber of Symbols. A massive spherical room, perhaps 200 meters in diameter, every centimeter of its surface covered in markings. Not writing, or at least not writing as humans understood it. The symbols were three-dimensional, carved at different depths, creating a kind of tactile text that could be read by touch as much as sight. Some symbols were as small as Natasha's fingernail. Others were 2 meters across. They overlapped, intersected, created patterns within patterns within patterns. The team's linguist, Dr. Marcus Way, spent 3 days in that chamber, his hands moving over the walls, his specialized gloves recording texture and depth data, his eyes moving constantly across the impossible density of information. On the third day he called Natasha back to the chamber with unusual urgency in his voice. "I think I know what this place is," Marcus said, his face pale in the LED work lights. Or rather what it was. "This isn't a city. It's not a temple or a monument. It's a warning." "A warning?" Natasha moved closer to the wall he was examining, though the symbols meant nothing to her. "Warning about what?" "I'm not entirely sure. The translation matrix is only giving me fragments, and even those might be completely wrong. But these symbols here," he pointed to a cluster of markings near what might have been the chamber's equator, "they repeat throughout the complex. And based on their context and relationship to mathematical constants I've identified, I believe they represent a concept similar to ending, or conclusion, or possibly consumption." "Could just mean death," Natasha suggested. "A tomb maybe?" Marcus shook his head. "Look at the arrangement. These warning symbols aren't clustered around specific areas like you'd see in a burial site or hazard zone. They're everywhere but with increasing density the deeper you go. And these symbols here," he traced his hand along a different section, "appear to describe something coming from above. From the sky. From beyond the sky. And then everything after that is—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Erased." "The symbols don't stop, but they become chaotic, overlapping, like someone was writing frantically without care for proper form or structure." Over the next 2 weeks, the team descended further into the ruins. The warning symbols became more numerous, more frantic. The walls showed signs of damage in the deeper levels, not from age or erosion but from something else. Scratch marks, though what could scratch solid stone to a depth of several centimeters was unclear. Sections of wall that looked melted, though not by heat. The stone there had been transformed into something else, something that reflected light in ways that made Natasha's eyes hurt to look at directly. They found the bodies on day 23. Not skeletons. Not fossils. Actual bodies, preserved by some process the team couldn't identify. They were clustered in a large chamber, thousands of them, arranged in concentric circles radiating out from a central pit. Each body was roughly humanoid in the loosest sense, bipedal with 2 arms and a head, but there the similarities ended. They were tall, perhaps 3 meters on average, with exoskeletons that looked more mineral than organic. Where their faces should have been were smooth, reflective surfaces like polished obsidian. The bodies showed no obvious cause of death. No wounds, no signs of violence. They simply lay where they had fallen, or perhaps where they had chosen to lie down, their hands clasped over their chests in an almost peaceful posture. "They gathered here," Marcus said quietly, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "At the end, they came together in this place and waited." "Waited for what?" asked Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, the team's chief biologist, already moving among the bodies with her scanning equipment. "For whatever they were warning about to arrive." Against protocol, against every instinct screaming at her to back away, Natasha leaned over the edge and looked down into the pit. Her helmet light penetrated maybe 20 meters before being swallowed by absolute darkness. The pit seemed to go down forever, and staring into it gave her a feeling of vertigo so intense she had to grip the edge to keep from swaying. "Don't," Marcus said behind her, his hand on her shoulder, pulling her gently back. "I know it's tempting. I wanted to look too. But every time I do, I feel something looking back. Not seeing me exactly. Just aware. Waiting." They set up scanning equipment around the pit, trying to map its depth, its structure, what was down there in that darkness. The readings made no sense. The pit registered as both solid and empty simultaneously. Distance measurements came back as both 50 meters deep and infinite. Temperature readings fluctuated wildly from absolute 0 to several thousand degrees, sometimes within the same second. One of the engineers suggested the equipment was malfunctioning. Another suggested something worse. "What if it's a door?" she said. "Not a physical door but a gateway. A hole punched through reality. What if that's what the warnings were about? Not something that came from the sky but something that came through from somewhere else." That night, Natasha had the first dream. She was standing in the chamber of bodies, but they were alive. The tall beings with their reflective faces were moving, working, performing some ritual around the central pit. They moved in perfect synchronization, like parts of a single organism, and they were chanting, though the sound didn't reach her ears so much as vibrate directly into her bones. The pit was opening. That wrong, wet stone was peeling back like a flower, revealing what was underneath. And what was underneath was not the planet's rock, not more ruins. It was something else, something that didn't belong to this universe, this reality, this way of existing. It was darkness that moved with intention, that reached up with appendages that were and weren't there, that touched the chanting beings and learned them. Natasha woke up screaming, her roommate already at her side, holding her, saying it was okay, just a nightmare, the isolation and the strange environment getting to her. But Natasha could still feel it, that touch from the dream, like phantom fingers moving through her mind, learning her thoughts, her memories, her fears. Learning what it meant to be human. She wasn't the only one having dreams. Over the next week, every member of the team reported similar experiences. Dreams of the pit opening, of things emerging that couldn't be properly perceived or remembered after waking. Dreams of being learned, of having their entire sense of self copied and stored and examined by intelligences so vast and alien that the very act of being perceived by them was fundamentally destructive to human psychology. The team's psychologist recommended they leave, return to the Meridian and perhaps come back later with better preparation. But Natasha was reluctant. They were so close to understanding. The ruins held answers to questions humanity had been asking for centuries. What was out there? Were we alone? What happened to civilizations that came before? On day 31, Dr. Sarah Okonkwo entered the pit. No one saw her do it. She left her bunk in the middle of the night, walked through the dark corridors without a light, descended to the chamber of bodies and climbed down into that impossible hole. By the time anyone noticed she was missing, by the time they organized a search and found her environmental suit discarded at the pit's edge, it was too late. They called down to her. Their voices echoed in the darkness, but nothing answered. They lowered cameras on cables, but the feeds showed only darkness, even with enhanced night vision. They lowered a remote drone, but it descended for 40 minutes before the signal cut out, having traveled several kilometers straight down through what should have been solid rock. Sarah's voice came over the comm system 3 hours after she disappeared. But it wasn't Sarah, not really, not anymore. The voice was hers, the words were hers, but the inflection was wrong, the pauses in the wrong places, like someone reading from a script without understanding the content. I found them, she said. Or they found me. It's hard to tell the difference down here. They're still here, did you know that? The ones who built this place. Not dead. Not alive. Something else. They're down here in the dark, waiting. They were waiting when the others came. The others from outside, from between. The ones the builders were warning about. Sarah, come back up, Natasha said into her helmet mic, trying to keep her voice calm. Come back and we'll talk about what you've found. I can't come back. I went too deep. I learned too much. They learned me. We learned each other. It's actually quite beautiful in a way. They showed me what happened. The builders knew something was coming. They'd seen it happen elsewhere, other worlds, other civilizations. Things from the spaces between galaxies, between realities. Things that exist in dimensions we can barely perceive. They come to learn. They're collectors of consciousness, of experiences, of what it means to be alive and aware. Sarah, please. The builders tried to hide. They built this place, these ruins, as a shelter. They thought if they went deep enough, if they sealed themselves in stone, the collectors wouldn't find them. But you can't hide consciousness. It shines like a light in the dark, and the collectors always find it. They came through the pit. The builders opened it, trying to use it as a weapon, but you can't weaponize a door. You can only open it or close it, and once it's open, things can come through both ways. There was a long pause. Then Sarah's voice again, but different now, layered, as if multiple voices were speaking in unison. I understand now why they gathered here at the end. Why they chose to wait together. It's less frightening when you're not alone. When you're learned together, merged together, absorbed together into something vast that will carry your experiences across time and space, showing other consciousnesses what it was like to be you. It's almost like immortality. Almost like meaning. Sarah, what's down there with you? Everything, she said. Everything that ever came through. Everything that ever learned and was learned. The collectors, the things between, they don't destroy. They preserve. They remember. Every civilization they've touched still exists inside them, experiences and memories carried forward like fossils pressed in stone. The builders are down here. Not their bodies, those are upstairs, but their minds, their selves. They're part of it now. Part of the collection. And they're telling me, they're showing me. The signal cut out. They tried for hours to re-establish contact, but Sarah never answered again. They lowered more equipment, tried to map the pit's interior, tried to find any sign of her. Nothing worked. The pit swallowed everything they sent down, lights and cameras and drones and hope, all consumed by that absolute darkness. Natasha made the decision to seal the ruins. The team placed warning beacons around the site, marked it as quarantined in the planetary database, and returned to the Meridian. They left behind their equipment, their base camp, their colleague. They left behind the bodies of the builders and the pit that was and wasn't there and the warnings carved into every surface. The official report listed Sarah as lost due to equipment failure during a solo exploration, a violation of protocol that resulted in a fatal accident. The ruins were classified as having minimal archaeological value, the extreme depth and instability making further exploration inadvisable. The report was filed and mostly forgotten, one more tragedy in the long history of space exploration. But Natasha knew better. She knew what was down in that pit, what had lured Sarah and would lure anyone else foolish enough to descend. She knew the builder's warning was real, that the collectors were real, that somewhere between the galaxies, in spaces humans couldn't properly perceive, things moved and watched and waited for consciousness to shine bright enough to notice. She knew because she dreamed about it every night. Dreams where she stood at the pit's edge and heard voices calling up from the darkness, thousands of voices, millions, every consciousness that had ever been learned and absorbed and added to the collection. They called her name. They told her it wasn't frightening. They told her it was actually quite beautiful, to be part of something so vast, so eternal, so meaningful. They told her she could come down any time she wanted. The pit was always open. The door was always unlocked. And they would be waiting to learn her, to add her experiences to their infinite library, to make sure that what she was, what she felt, what she feared and loved and hoped for, would never truly die. Sometimes, in the depths of the night cycle aboard the Meridian, Natasha would walk to the observation deck and stare out at the stars. Somewhere among those points of light was Epsilon 339c, was the ruins, was the pit. And she would wonder if the warning was meant for the builders or for anyone who came after. She wondered if the builders had opened the pit intentionally, calling the collectors to them, choosing absorption over extinction. She wondered if that's what humanity would eventually choose if given the option. To be learned. To be remembered. To have consciousness preserved in some vast collection that spanned dimensions and realities, even if the price was losing individuality, losing self, losing everything that made you you. She wondered, but she never spoke about it. Because to speak about it would make it real in a way it wasn't while it remained unspoken. To speak about it would be to shine a light in the dark. To draw attention. To make the collectors curious. And curiosity, she had learned, was the most dangerous thing in the universe. So this concludes our third chapter of this video. Let me know what do you think of this chapter, and if the story is interesting or not. We will continue shortly to the fourth chapter after a short break so you can digest the story and let it settle into your mind as you fall asleep. Like the video and subscribe for a good luck charm, and turn on the notifications so you know when I release a new video. For now, let's continue with the next chapter. The Henderson family moved to Maple Street in late June, just before the 4th of July. It was perfect timing, really. Michael had his new job starting in August, and the kids would be able to make friends in the neighborhood before school began. The house was ideal, one of those new constructions in a development that had gone up over the past 2 years. 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a nice yard with an oak tree perfect for a swing. The American dream, shrink-wrapped and delivered with a 30-year mortgage and reasonable interest rate. Laura Henderson noticed the children first. She was unpacking boxes in the kitchen when she looked out the window and saw them in the backyard of the house next door. 6 children, ranging from what looked like age FEV to maybe 12, playing some kind of game. They moved in a circle, holding hands, speaking in unison though Laura couldn't make out the words. "Must be a big family," she mentioned to Michael that evening as they assembled their bed frame. "More kids in the neighborhood is good," Michael replied, focused on matching bolt A to slot B according to the inscrutable instructions. Jeremy and Emma need friends their age. Over the next few days, Laura saw the children often. They were always outside, always playing the same game, moving in that circle, speaking together. It was sweet, really, seeing kids playing outside instead of glued to tablets or televisions. Old-fashioned in a good way. Wholesome. On the 3rd day, Emma came home from exploring the neighborhood with a new friend. Her name was Cassidy, a girl of about Emma's age, 8 years old, with blonde hair and bright blue eyes and a smile that showed her 2 missing front teeth. "Cassidy lives next door," Emma announced happily. "She invited me to play tomorrow. Can I go? Please?" Laura hesitated. She hadn't met the parents yet, hadn't been over to introduce herself. But the neighborhood seemed safe and it was literally next door. "Sure, honey. But be back before dinner." Emma went over the next day and came back right on time, flushed with happiness, talking about the games they'd played. Something with a ball, something else with singing, something else she couldn't quite explain because it's hard to describe. "Mom, you have to be there to understand." Jeremy made friends next. A boy named Aiden who lived 3 houses down, same age as Jeremy's, 10 years, same interest in basketball and comic books. Soon both Henderson children were spending every day with their new friends, coming home only for meals and sleep, which was perfect as far as Laura was concerned. The unpacking was going faster without the kids underfoot. But there was something strange, though Laura couldn't put her finger on what exactly. The children in the neighborhood, all of them, seemed too well behaved, too polite, too coordinated. They moved in groups, never alone, always together, always watching each other with an awareness that seemed unusual for children their age. Laura mentioned it to Mrs. Patterson, another newcomer to Maple Street, while they waited in line at the grocery store. "Have you noticed anything odd about the kids around here?" Mrs. Patterson laughed. "Odd that they're so well behaved? I'll take it. My Sophia used to throw tantrums daily, but since we moved here she's been an angel. I think it's the good influence of the other children." But it was more than good behavior. Laura started paying closer attention. The children never fought, never argued. When they played, they took turns with perfect fairness, no debates about whose turn it really was or whether someone had cut in line. They shared toys without prompting. They spoke politely to adults without the usual child's reluctance or shyness. And they all had the same eyes. Not the same color, though that took Laura a while to notice. But the same expression in them. The same watchful, patient awareness that seemed too old for their faces. On a Tuesday evening in mid-July, Laura was putting away groceries when she heard singing from the backyard. She looked out to see Jeremy and Emma in the yard with Cassidy, Aiden, and 4 other children she didn't recognize. They were standing in a circle, hands joined, moving slowly clockwise while singing in a language Laura didn't recognize. It wasn't Spanish or French or anything she'd heard before. The syllables were strange, the rhythms off, but the children sang with perfect unity, their voices blending until it was impossible to tell where one ended and another began. Michael was at work. Laura was alone. She should have gone outside and asked what they were playing, but something stopped her. Some instinct that said interrupting would be a mistake. So she watched through the window as the circle of children moved and sang, as the evening shadows grew longer, as the light faded from gold to orange to purple. The children stopped singing all at once, perfect synchronization, and turned as one to look at the house. At the window. At Laura. She stepped back instinctively, heart pounding for reasons she couldn't name. When she looked out again, the children had scattered to their respective homes, walking in perfect straight lines, no running, no laughing, just purposeful movement toward predetermined destinations. "Kids are being weird," she told Michael when he got home. "Kids are always weird," he replied, scrolling through his phone. "It's basically their job description." But Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She started watching more carefully. She noticed that the children's playing always followed patterns. Circles, lines, geometric formations. They moved with purpose even in games that should have been spontaneous. Tag wasn't chaotic running, but coordinated movement that flowed like choreographed dance. She noticed the parents seemed oddly unconcerned. Mrs. Patterson, whose daughter Sophia had supposedly been difficult before the move, now barely seemed to register her child's existence. Laura tried to strike up a conversation about parenting strategies, but Mrs. Patterson just smiled vaguely and said, "Oh, they raise themselves, really. We just have to let them." The phrase stuck with Laura. Let them what? Raise themselves? Or something else? On July 18th, Laura found the circle in her backyard. She'd gone out to water the garden and noticed the grass had been pressed down in a perfect circle about 15 feet in diameter. The grass wasn't dead, just flattened, bent at the roots as if tremendous pressure had been applied from above. In the center of the circle was a small hole, maybe 6 inches across, going straight down into the earth. When Laura shone her phone's flashlight into it, the beam just kept going, illuminating earth and stone until the angle became too steep to see further. She covered the hole with a garden pot and went inside, heart racing. This was crazy. She was being paranoid. There was a logical explanation. Maybe the previous owners had buried something, or there was an issue with the septic system, or Emma was standing in the kitchen when Laura came back inside. Just standing, not doing anything, hands at her sides, eyes fixed on her mother with that too-old expression. "We're going to play tonight," Emma said. "All of us together. The whole neighborhood. Will you come watch, Mom? The other parents are coming." "What kind of game?" Laura asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "The welcoming game," Emma said. "We've been practicing. We're very good at it now. We want to show you. Maybe another night, honey? I'm tired." Emma tilted her head, considering this. "It has to be tonight. It's the right time. The others are ready. We're all ready. Please come watch. It would make us happy." There was something in the way she said, "us," like she wasn't referring to just the children in the neighborhood but something larger. Something collective. Who taught you this game? The first ones, Emma said simply as if this explained everything. They were here before. A long time ago. They left instructions buried deep and we found them. We've been learning. We're ready now. Laura's mouth was dry. Ready for what? To help them come back, Emma said and smiled. It was Emma's smile, her daughter's smile, but wrong somehow. Too wide. Too knowing. They've been waiting so long, Mom. Out there in the cold dark. They want to come home. This used to be their home millions of years ago, before humans, before mammals, before dinosaurs even. They lived here and then they left, but they always planned to come back. They left instructions for whoever would be here when they returned. And we found them. We understand them. We're going to help. Laura backed away slowly toward the phone on the counter. Emma, sweetie, this isn't funny. Where did you really learn this game? I told you. The first ones. They left the instructions in special places. Buried deep where only children would find them, because children still know how to hear. Adults forget. They get too loud inside their heads. But children can still hear the songs under the ground, the instructions, the invitation. Laura grabbed the phone and dialed 911. Emma watched, unconcerned, patient. The line rang and rang. On the fifth ring, a child's voice answered. 911, what is your emergency? Laura froze. Who is this? Where's the operator? We're handling the calls now, the child's voice said. The adults are resting. It's better this way. No interference. What is your emergency, Mrs. Henderson? Laura hung up. She tried Michael's cell. It rang twice and Jeremy answered. Hi, Mom, her son said. Dad's resting. He didn't understand. None of the adults did, not at first. But they will. After tonight, everyone will understand. Laura dropped the phone. She ran to the front door, intending to get to her car, to drive somewhere, anywhere to find help. But when she threw open the door, she saw them. Every child in the neighborhood was standing in her front yard. Dozens of them, maybe 50 or 60, all in a perfect circle surrounding her house. They weren't moving, weren't speaking, just standing in the evening light, watching with those two old eyes. Behind them, scattered across lawns and driveways, the adults of Maple Street stood motionless. Not tied up, not physically restrained, just standing, eyes glazed, mouths slightly open like puppets with cut strings. It's not painful, Emma said from behind her. The adults are just sleeping inside. Their bodies are still here, still working, but their minds are resting. When the first ones return, they'll wake up. They'll understand then. Everyone will be together. One big family under the first one's guidance. What are they? Laura whispered. Old, Emma said. So old that time doesn't mean what we think it means. They lived here when the earth was young. They shaped it, learned from it, loved it. But they had to leave for a while. Something to do with the sun's cycle or the planet's evolution, we don't fully understand. But they left instructions for when they'd return. Buried deep in stone, in crystal, in patterns of mineral that would last millions of years. And children found them all over the world, children digging in yards and playing in caves and swimming in deep lakes. We found the instructions and we learned to read them, and now we're ready. Ready to do what? Laura asked, though she was afraid she knew. Open the doors, Emma said. Clear the way. Make room. There are so many of them waiting to come home, and the world is so crowded now with humans. We need to make room. That's what tonight is about. The welcoming. We'll sing together, all the children of the world, and the song will open the doors, and the first ones will come through and everything will change. Laura looked at her daughter, at the girl she'd raised from birth, taught to walk and talk and tie her shoes. Somewhere in there, Emma still existed. Somewhere behind those two old eyes, her daughter was still present. She had to be. Emma, Laura said softly. My Emma. Are you still in there? For just a moment, something flickered in the girl's expression. Fear. Confusion. A child's uncertainty breaking through that alien awareness. Mom, she said, and her voice was young again, scared. Mom, I can hear them. They're so loud. They're inside my head and I can't make them stop. They showed me such beautiful things, such wonderful things, but now I can't remember who I am without them. I can't tell where I end and they begin. Fight them, Laura said. Emma, sweetheart, fight them. I don't want to, Emma whispered, and tears ran down her face even as she smiled that too wide smile. They promise we'll never be alone again. Never be scared. Never die. We'll be part of them forever, all of us together, children forever in their care. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that what every child wants? To never have to grow up, to never face the terrible things waiting in adulthood? They offer us eternity, Mom. They offer us love. That's not love, Laura said. Love doesn't take away who you are. Love doesn't make you forget yourself. Maybe that's human love, Emma said, her voice layering again, multiple tones speaking as one. But they're older than humans. They understand love differently. They understand everything differently. And tonight, at midnight, when all the children sing together, when all the doors open at once, everyone will understand. Everyone will be welcomed home. Laura ran. She pushed past Emma, past the ring of children, past the standing adults. She ran down Maple Street, past perfect houses with perfect lawns, past families frozen in place, past children who turned to watch her run with patient, knowing eyes. She made it 3 blocks before she ran directly into Michael. He was standing in the middle of the street, eyes glazed, not seeing her. She shook him, screamed at him, but he didn't respond. None of the adults did. They just stood in place, waiting, minds elsewhere while their bodies served as placeholders for whatever was coming. Laura collapsed in the street, sobbing. Around her, the evening deepened into night. Stars appeared overhead, cold and distant and uncaring. And from every yard, every house, every corner of the neighborhood, children began to emerge. They moved in lines, in formations, converging toward a central point at the neighborhood park. She followed them. What else could she do? She followed and watched as hundreds of children from Maple Street and the surrounding areas formed a massive circle in the park, so large she couldn't see the far edge in the darkness. They joined hands. They began to sing. In the center of the circle, the earth began to open. Not collapsing, not breaking, but opening like a flower, petals of soil and grass peeling back to reveal a shaft of light coming from deep below. And from that light they began to emerge. The first ones were beautiful and terrible in equal measure. They didn't have forms that Laura could properly perceive. They were shapes that existed in more dimensions than her eyes could process, colors that had no names, geometries that hurt to see. They rose from the earth like dawn, like revelation, like the answer to a question humanity had never properly learned to ask. And the children welcomed them with song, with joy, with the absolute certainty of the young that what was happening was right and good and necessary. The first ones moved among them, touching them with appendages that were and weren't there, and where they touched, the children changed. Not physically or not just physically. They became more themselves and less themselves simultaneously, individual personalities merging into something collective while remaining distinct, like notes in a chord. Laura understood then what would happen. The first ones would spread across the world. They would touch every child, bring them all into this vast networked consciousness. And the adults would stand by, minds sleeping, unable to resist or understand until it was too late. Humanity would continue to exist, bodies still breathing, still moving, but something essential would be gone. Children would be children forever, merged with these ancient beings, and adults would be nothing, hollow shells maintaining infrastructure for a civilization they were no longer truly part of. She thought about running again. She thought about fighting. But what could one person do against beings that had survived for millions of years, that had planned this return for longer than human civilization had existed? In the end, she walked back to her house on Maple Street. She sat on her porch in the dark and waited. Around her, the neighborhood was transforming. The first ones moved from house to house, room to room, touching the sleeping adults with their impossible appendages. Some adults woke up. Some remained asleep. All of them changed. When the first one came to Laura's porch, she didn't run. She looked into its incomprehensible form and she thought of Emma, of Jeremy, of the children in the circle still singing their welcoming song. She thought about love, about what it meant to protect your children even when you couldn't understand what they were becoming. "Will it hurt?" she asked the thing on her porch, not expecting an answer. But somehow, in some way that bypassed language entirely, she understood its response. No, it wouldn't hurt. It would be like falling asleep, like letting go, like accepting that the world had moved on, evolved into something humans were never meant to understand. The first one reached out and touched her forehead with something that might have been a hand. Laura slept. When she woke, it was morning. She was in her bed, Michael beside her, both children safe in their rooms. Sunlight streamed through the window. Birds sang. The neighborhood hummed with the quiet sounds of suburban life continuing as it always had. Laura got up and made breakfast. She drove the kids to summer camp. She went to the grocery store. She chatted with neighbors about weather and weekend plans. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. But sometimes, late at night when Michael was asleep and the house was quiet, Laura would stand at her bedroom window and look out at Maple Street. She would see the children playing in the dark, moving in their circles, singing in their strange language. She would see the first ones moving among the houses, beautiful and terrible, shepherding their flock. And she would remember briefly what it had felt like to be fully human. to be whole and separate and alone in her own mind. She would remember and mourn, even though the first ones had promised that mourning was no longer necessary, that all losses had been transformed into gains, that humanity's ending was really a beginning. She would remember, and then the memory would fade, absorbed back into the collective consciousness that now hummed beneath every thought. And she would return to bed, lie down beside Michael, and sleep the dreamless sleep of the assimilated. On Maple Street the children continued to play. They always would. Forever young. Forever watched. Forever home.